Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Arizona Illustrated for Friday, the 28th of September, 2012. I'm Jim Ninsel, host of Political Roundtable, our weekly analysis and commentary on local, state, and national politics. Tonight on the Roundtable, we bring you a special Your Vote 2012 forum featuring the candidates for the Arizona House of Representatives in Legislative District 9. This new district is evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, making it one of the most competitive in the state. It includes the north side of Tucson, the Catalina foothills, and parts of Marana. Let's meet the candidates for the two House seats in Legislative District 9. We have Republican Ethan Orr, Democrat Victoria Steele, and Democrat Mohur Sarah Sidhwa. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ethan, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you got into this race.
Well, you know, I grew up here. I was born and raised in Tucson, and I run a nonprofit agency. I've done that for the past 9 years. We help people with disabilities find jobs, and veterans. We help 713 people find work, and I believe everyone has a purpose, and part of that purpose is the job you do. I've been a director of economic development, both for South Tucson and for Tucson. I got their empowerment zone, so I understand the importance of bringing good businesses to our community. My parents taught for TUSD, and I myself am an adjunct professor at the U of A. I've taught in the classroom for 10 years, so I understand the value of education, and I want to bring that to the legislature as well.
And Mohur, how about you? You got into this race because?
I got into this race because I had issues I thought were worth fighting for, primarily amongst them education and science and math education. I found when I was teaching at the U of A, I found there were too many kids coming out of high school that really did not have critical thinking ability or math skills or especially science skills. So that brought me into it, but what kept me in it and gave me the fighting abilities were some of the more interesting bills passed by our legislature, and they kind of got me upset, especially when they closed down women's shelters for domestic violence, and then they cut off funding for hospice care. And I thought to myself, this cannot be allowed to happen, not in my Arizona. And then they started cutting education funding for higher education, universities, community colleges. How can we grow the economy? How can we possibly compete in the 21st century if they are gutting our K through 12 as well as our higher education? And that just kept me going because I love Arizona too much. It has been my home for 31 years. And I felt I had some things to say. Okay, and Victoria?
I have been in Tucson for about 25 years, and 15 of that within the district that is now LD9. I am a counselor in private practice. I do marriage counseling, depression, anger management, anxiety counseling, and trauma. And I also teach at a couple of different colleges. I teach graduate students counseling skills and psychology. And I have a 25-year career in radio and television. That was a long time ago. Most of that was here in Tucson. And I have been watching and seeing how people are struggling. People are really getting slammed by this recession. And I have seen extremists take hold of our state and take us in a very bad direction. And I want to change that. And I'm going to advocate. I've been advocating for people on a one-to-one level for a long time as a counselor. So now I'm going to advocate for people in my community. I'm going to advocate for Southern Arizona.
All right. And I think you've all expressed some concern about education funding. Mm-hmm. Mohur, the Center for Budget Priorities, I think, just released a report that Arizona suffered some of the worst cuts or the worst cuts in the nation over the last few years. Mm-hmm. Your thoughts on education funding and how you would, if you would, restore that?
Absolutely, because we cannot ever again divorce the economic component from the education component in Arizona, because we cannot have a ready workforce unless we have education. We cannot keep outsourcing our high-tech stuff or insourcing from elsewhere. Education is the key to the success that our children need. These are the tools. Education is a tool for success. How can we possibly shortchange our whole next generation because of some mindless ideology or wherever these people might be coming from? I don't understand their lack of respect for children and their education. And that relates directly to the economy. We need to attract businesses to Arizona. We can't do that while being rock bottom in per pupil spending in pretty much the whole nation. We cannot allow that to continue.
And Victoria, your thoughts on restoring education funding, and if so, where do you find the money?
Well, we have cut, the Arizona legislature has cut about $2 billion from education, $2 billion with a B, in the last few years. And they have resulted in the firings of 6,000 teachers. And as Mohur just said, we are now at rock bottom in terms of per student funding. And we cannot grow our economy that way. We need to reprioritize. We need to shift things around. We are spending much more money to keep somebody in prison per year than we are to educate them. It cost about $9,000 to get an education at the U of A for 1 year. It cost about $60,000 to keep one person in prison for a year. And that has been where I've seen the priorities be placed. And that doesn't make any sense. We cannot have an economy, a state that is dependent on having more and more prison inmates. That doesn't make sense. And if we keep cutting education, we're going to need those prison beds.
Okay, and Ethan, your thoughts on the recent cuts in education and how you go about, if indeed you support restoring that funding, how you go about doing that?
Well, it's not just restoring the funding. I think it's also choosing to spend that money wisely. When I was in economic development, I worked closely with the SlimFast plant, and it was troubling to me that I worked closely with their HR, and we couldn't fill those positions. In fact, that's why that company left, because of our tax structure and because of our workforce. And so for that reason, I was one of the many people that helped create the JTED in 2006. I'm a huge believer in the JTED. And then I was dismayed in 2008 when that funding was cut. And I think if you look at why that funding was cut, it was because the Phoenix people looked at the structure of the East Valley JTED, which are 3-year programs, and they didn't, no one in the Southern Arizona delegation raised their hand and say, whoa, everything here is a 2- or 4-year program. So for an $8 million savings, we put vocational education in complete disarray. I have already met with the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and a representative of the Governor's office and said, we need to restore this, because this is opportunity and hope for a lot of non-college bound and even college bound seniors. The other thing that's very important to me is looking at our full-time student enrollment. I'm a big proponent, back in the 80s they called it the 2+2+2 system, but I'm a big proponent of dual enrollment, where I can be a college senior at Amphi or university, and I can work towards an associate's degree or even a baccalaureate degree. This is the best way to draw students into higher education, and I think we need to look at those formulas to encourage that.
Let me follow up with the education question. Do you support the 1 cent sales tax proposal on the ballot this November that would fund, I think 80% of it would go to education?
You know, I actually don't. And there's 2 reasons I don't. One, I think a sales tax is, by its very nature, regressive, and I think a disproportionate impact would fall down on the poor and the working class, people that I've spent my entire career trying to help. In addition, the thing that I look at, anytime you mandate a revenue stream, people are good at shell games, and they'll find a way of taking that money away. Already, you have the state legislature that only controls about 1/3 of the budget. That's why you saw the spending cuts fall so disproportionately on higher education, because you're trying to balance 100% of the budget on 33% of what you actually control. I think if you support education the way I do, you need to elect pro-education representatives and give them the latitude and the discretion to make the right choices.
All right. Mohur, the 1 cent sales tax proposal.
Education was one of the responsibilities of our legislature, and they were sorely negligent, I would say derelict in their duty there. I don't like regressive taxes. I know they hit those who can afford it the least, and the 1 cent sales tax is regressive. Having said that, I abhor an uneducated child even more. A child not having education through no fault of their own, that is much worse. So when I look at 2 things I don't like, I will always err in favor of the child. But we should never have gotten to this stage with the extremists in Phoenix, that we would have to do that to ourselves.
And Victoria, your thoughts on supporting the sales tax?
I absolutely support this sales tax. It is the only thing at this point that's going to give us a guaranteed funding source for education. Our legislature in the past, ruled by extreme Republicans, have taken the heart, they've just gutted it, and they have left us with an international embarrassment, a national embarrassment with our education. They cannot keep taking that money. We have to fund public education. And that's probably an area where Ethan might not support exactly the Prop 204 as well, because I throw my full support behind public education, not just education in general.
Let me follow up on the public versus private education.
Yes.
Charter schools are, there are quite a few charter schools here in Arizona, and there's talk of possibly changing the Arizona Constitution to allow public dollars to flow to private religious and other schools. Do you support that?
No, I definitely do not support that. I think with charter schools, we need to have more oversight. There has to be an accountability that might be missing at this point. A lot of money is being spent through charter schools. I think it's $1,900 per student for the building and construction funding for charter school students. And you don't really see that with public education. Also, with public schools, the teachers don't have to be certified. That's frightening to me. That's very frightening. So we're putting a lot of money to a place that's not held as accountable. I'm not in favor of that, and I'm certainly not in favor of taking tax dollars and putting it to private schools, because that means that there are going to be children that don't get into those schools.
Okay.
A public school is for everybody.
And Mohur, your thoughts on whether public dollars should support private schools, and also where we are with charter schools in the state?
When the charter school system first started, it was a pilot program under Governor Napolitano. Because I remember that well. Initially, I was very excited about it because the way it was sold. But what it has become now, it's kind of like a scheme. There are some really good charter schools, really good. But the vast majority have no oversight. They go into business, take the money, declare bankruptcy, keep the buildings that they have bought with public funds. That's one of the downside, because they're allowed to do that. Because of the lack of accountability, and also because their teachers are not required to be certified. And so they could be PhDs and wonderful, or they could be complete ignorance. Nonetheless, with regards to your question about private schools, I grew up in a part of the world where we had a two-tier school system, the public school and the private school. And that led to a two-tier economy. Our public school produced the Apollo program. Our public schools produced the best scientists, the best innovators. And that is what must be respected.
Okay. And Ethan, your thoughts on both the growth of charter schools and whether they need more regulation, and also whether we should allow public dollars to flow to the private schools?
Well, I'll tell you, I myself am a product of public schools here in Arizona. And what's important to me is that every child has an opportunity for a world-class education. In fact, I have met with all of the superintendents in this area, and what I've told them is if I get elected, I'm going to be a freshman. I can't do everything. But I will be part of the majority caucus, which means that I will have the ability to do 2 or 3 things. Mr. and Mrs. Superintendent, what is it that would help let me support your school district and make your school district more effective at serving the students? And we've had some very frank and candid conversations. I mean, for example, Flowing Wells, Dr. Clements wanted, and it's a very simple change, but the school facilities board is auditing him because he's keeping his schools open for the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods love him. He wants to keep those facilities open. That is an easy fix, and that is part of the job of the legislature to support in innovative and I think simple ways those school districts. Now that said, I think we do need to give access to all types of schools for families and for individuals, for students. And that may be through a scholarship program. I think that if a family wants to send their child to a charter school or to a private school or a public school, they should have that opportunity. In fact, the concept is one that the TOSD has been using with the magnet schools since the 70s. I mean, you look at University High, and it's probably the best education. In fact, I would argue it's the best education, the most rigorous education you're going to get in this valley. And every student in TUSD has the opportunity to apply and attend that school. I think the principles that drive the magnet schools and the principles that drive the charter schools should be in play for all families. Everyone should have an education. In fact, that's why charter schools were created, to give low-income, less affluent families an opportunity to get a good education.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit to health care. A big question that lies before the legislature at this point is, provided the Affordable Care Act remains in place, is whether or not to expand health care to 133% of the federal poverty level. Of course, we know that the access eligibility has been rolled back for childless adults, but if the state does expand to 133%, we'll get over $1 billion in federal funding, but it will cost the state a couple $100 million, at least initially here. Victoria, do you support this expansion?
Absolutely. I don't think that we can't afford not. I know it's a double negative, but we cannot afford to miss this opportunity. For every dollar that is spent here, there will be 10 or more federal dollars spent per person. If we have this, we can fund health care. That's one of the big things that got me into this race in the first place, is I'm seeing people whose needs are not being met. I'm seeing people taken out of treatment. I'm seeing people in the middle of cancer care not have their health care. And particularly with access, we need this. We cannot have people getting sick because they can't afford health care. We can't afford people going broke because they can't afford insurance. I just had a friend of my mother's just died about 3 or 4 weeks ago. She couldn't afford health insurance. She got sick. She didn't go to the doctor. And then she died. It was stomach cancer. It might have been detected, I don't know, but she couldn't afford. People should not die in this country, in this state, because they can't afford health insurance. And if Access can do this, we can't afford not to fund Access.
Okay. Ethan, your thoughts on that expansion that would be necessary in order to get those federal dollars?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, and I agree with Victoria, it's a very good investment. For every dollar that I put into prenatal or preventative care, I'm actually systemically going to reap about $7 back. So I think anything that we can do to support women and young children is extremely valuable. I think looking at the implementation of the healthcare exchanges, I do like the transition that the medical community is moving towards the medical home model. What that is that's an integrated cost, or basically an integrated health system where all of my provision and all of my health, both mental and physical, is going to be under the same thing. I've seen studies that say that there's about a 25% cost savings in doing this, so I think it's an effective and a very good way of doing it. I also look at the healthcare exchanges. I think that we need to, as a state, get ahead and start implementing the exchanges, because there are a number of principles that I've talked to people, healthcare professionals throughout the state, that if we integrate those into those exchanges, we can have a more effective system. For example, the health savings account concept. About 5 years ago, I moved my entire company to health savings accounts. It's how I paid for LASIK. So I no longer have those thick glasses. But I think that putting those types of incentives within our own exchanges, giving people co-pays, graduated co-pays, and then discounting that for preventative or well checks, and I think even giving them the ability to set aside a little bit for the future really makes a lot of sense.
And Mohur, expansion to the 133% of the federal
I think that's
level.
very essential. We have seen a consolidation of the market and the healthcare industry. For example, Tucson Heart Hospital had to shut its doors on its vascular and a lot of the stuff and move it to Carondelet, which means we're seeing a loss of beds, while the population coming to Tucson for healthcare, which is uninsured because of the cuts, is going up. So our healthcare infrastructure is in real trouble. This is no longer just about healthcare. This is an economic issue for our whole healthcare and especially our mental health community. Mm-hmm. This is unconscionable because we cannot gut our health care for our most vulnerable population. There's nobody more vulnerable than the severely mentally ill, who more often than not wind up incarcerated, costing the state so much more than the $16 a day they would save on somebody making sure they took their meds. There are so many problems with the cuts to access, but the biggest one is what it's doing to our whole healthcare industry. The unreimbursed care that our hospitals are providing are making them go broke. We're going to see emergency rooms perhaps closed down because they can't afford it anymore. I never used to be a fan of the large hospitals till I saw what they were doing and how desperately they were trying to keep the ERs open. So this was a very short-sighted thing to do. We lost money, Arizona lost money, and most importantly, because we didn't get the federal funds, we can no longer train it gets more difficult. It paid for the interns who were coming here. Usually those who train in Arizona tend to stay in Arizona. Luckily, other jurisdictions like the county, etc., stepped in and put up some of the money. But the legislature, in its wisdom, is even removing money from the counties. So,
okay, and on the subject of federal funding, the legislature passed a law this year that forbids federal funds that pass through the states from going to Planned Parenthood, even for health programs that have nothing to do with abortion. Ethan, or a good decision on the part of the legislature?
I think anytime you pass legislation that's aimed at an entity or an individual, you're usually going to end up with bad legislation. I think if the government should be in the business of funding function. And the counties, as you well know, are constitutionally mandated to have a public health function. Now, what I think needs to happen is that needs to stay there. The funding needs to go for that public health function. And if there are people that don't like that money going to Planned Parenthood, well, then I would recommend that they create a consortium of nonprofits or other entities that can provide that same function. Because to simply cut off money because we don't like an organization without having an alternative to provide that same constitutionally mandated public health function, I think does a disservice to the public.
And Mohur.
It was not about women's health per se. It was about choice and pregnancy terminations. That's what this thing was all about, and that's what these arguments have been all about. If Planned Parenthood did not provide, it's a very small part of their function, pregnancy termination services, this whole thing would not have gotten so blown out of proportion. Women's health would not have suffered. It's about women's health. And as far as I'm concerned, they are doing a service to the uninsured women. Pap smears, mammograms, one-stop shopping, birth control, not just for women, but also for men. Planned Parenthood also serves men. And so we lost all of this because of this narrow vision of morality that some people have. I am unabashedly pro-women's health, and I will stand up for it. I don't care whether it's through Planned Parenthood or wherever, but I would rather Planned Parenthood because they've had a track record. They've had a very good track record. And to demonize one organization, like I've seen the legislature do, and use that as an excuse is just unconscionable because it hurts people. It hurts children. It hurts women.
Okay, and Victoria.
I'm actually concerned as I hear Ethan talk because you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. You're with a forked tongue, if you will, because it doesn't make sense. I think what really it comes down to is you are not supportive of women's choices. You are not supportive of women's health, in that if you can cut without even thinking about it, if you could support cuts to Planned Parenthood that provides screenings, life-saving screenings, mammograms, pap smears, STD testing, if you can cut that for women, for millions of women, then where do they get that? How can you so easily cut women's access to affordable health care? How can you do that?
If you listen to what I said, I didn't say that at all. And one concern that I have, I call this teaching civil liberties. I call it my Jack Bauer moment. What we do is we don't engage in a genuine conversation. And I'll use a quick example and then move back to women's health issues. For example, torture. Should we torture? Yes or no? I mean, it's a legitimate conversation. But what we do in American political discourse with these very divisive wedge issues is we move you to one extreme or another. Mm-hmm. So I say, well, what if someone has a nuclear bomb and they're going to blow up Los Angeles in 5 minutes and you have to decide right now? And what we did is we just crossed that line. And then I start walking you back. It's Phoenix. It's a conventional weapon. And you don't realize that you just crossed that line. If you look at it, I actually
Nathan,
didn't say...
Where are you going? Where are you going with this?
What I'm saying...
We're talking torture?
No. What I'm saying, I'm using an example so that you can clearly see what you just did. What basically I would not cut, and if you heard what I said, I would not cut funding for Planned Parenthood that goes towards preventative health care, pap smear, women's health issues. I clearly said that, and I said that if you are looking to not have money go to Planned Parenthood, provide an alternative. Provide a consortium of agencies that would provide that benefit. Now, in terms
of... If the program is already there, if it's already functioning quite well, thank you very much, why do we need to cut the services?
Again, I'm not saying to cut the services. Where I see what we need to be talking about...
Would you, if you were elected, would you refund, would you restore those federal dollars to Planned Parenthood?
I would restore federal dollars towards women's issues, preventative care.
But not Planned Parenthood?
No. If Planned Parenthood was the only agency that was able to provide that, then that money would go towards Planned Parenthood, because that is an important public health service.
What about choice?
I think the main thing in terms of choice is, again, I want to focus on the 60 to 70% of women who are trapped by economic and familial circumstances that may not want to have an abortion. And my argument is, how do you help them? I think you need to support prenatal care, access.
And we're down to about 20 seconds here, so we're going to have to, if you want to make the point, you've got about 20 seconds.
Are you pro-choice or?
Basically, I want to support women to reduce the number of abortions in this state. Now, I do believe that it is a life. And because of that, I would do everything I can to protect that child.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. That is, unfortunately, all the time we have. I'm Jim Ninsel. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.